When you hear the word heritage, what comes to mind? You might be thinking of old buildings, the wonders of the natural world, or the cufflinks left to you by your legendary great-granddad. The truth is, heritage can be all these things and more. Heritage is what we inherit and also choose to protect and celebrate. Determining what heritage is important enough to protect is a complex process, but it's essential work because heritage belongs to all of us. For more information about Victorian heritage and how it is protected, see the Heritage Information Pack accompanying this video.
Well, after that introduction, hello, I'm Professor Philip Goad, Chair of the Heritage Council of Victoria. Before tonight commences, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I wish to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples tonight. The Heritage Council is an independent statutory body which identifies and protects places and objects of cultural heritage significance to the state of Victoria. Our role is to ensure that our diverse cultural heritage is enjoyed, managed and protected for current and future generations. This year, 2024, the Council is celebrating 50 years of the Victorian Heritage Register. In 1974, after many years of campaigning by Victorian conservation activists, the first buildings were included in the Victorian Historic Buildings Register to protect them for future and current generations. The Historic Buildings Register eventually became what we know today as the Victorian Heritage Register. I think we should be all very proud too, because Victoria was the first Australian state to establish a Heritage Council to recommend the registration of places and objects of state-level significance to be protected by a Heritage Register. That register provides legal protection for approximately 2,400 places and objects that are culturally significant. And the Victorian Heritage Register protects a variety of heritage, not just historic buildings, but heritage can be buildings, objects, collections, archaeological remains, gardens, shipwrecks, and much, much more. It's been quite fabulous to see the 50-year anniversary and the Victorian Heritage Register highlighted in this weekend's open house program. Please look out for our 50-year celebration logo in more events to come in 2024. The Heritage Council has had a long commitment to this, the Heritage Address, since 2009, in fact, and we're delighted it is now an annual cornerstone of the Open House Melbourne weekends. I'd now like to welcome Victoria's Planning Minister, the Honourable Sonia Kilkenny, to the stage to introduce tonight's speakers. Minister.
Well, good evening, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you, Philip, for the introduction. Can I too acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Bunurong Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my deepest respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect tonight to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us. The Victorian Government has been a long-term supporter of Open House Melbourne, and it is fantastic to see how it has grown over the past decade to become a compulsory event in Melbourne's midwinter calendar. It sure is midwinter out there tonight. The Open House program showcases how building and design contribute to making this amazing city of ours such an outstanding place to live and work. And I'm very pleased to introduce the Heritage Address this year when we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Victorian Heritage Register. The Register plays a vital part in protecting Victoria's significant heritage and includes around 2,400 places and objects, including over 400 within the City of Melbourne. We all know that heritage places are an important part of the character, fabric, and amenity of our cities and towns, and to the history and development of Victoria. You may know that we are currently undertaking extensive community engagement as we develop our new plan for Victoria, and a theme emerging through community feedback is the importance of protecting and enhancing significant built heritage in making our suburbs great. The Victorian Government is committed to investing in the state's heritage. This year, we are progressing World Heritage listing for Melbourne Trades Hall and the Victorian Goldfields, and we're delivering a grants program for state-listed heritage places impacted by disasters since the Black Summer bushfires. Through our new plan for Victoria, we are also undertaking statewide community consultation on the things which matter to Victorians and what we want to see protected as we create our vision for the future. Protecting our heritage so that we can continue to enjoy and learn from it from one generation to the next is so incredibly important. And I'm so pleased that the Heritage Address has become a key part of Melbourne Open House, delivered in collaboration with Heritage Council of Victoria. Former high-profile speakers include Katrina Sedgwick, Michael Davidge, Tim Ross and Kirsten Thompson. Tonight's Heritage Address is a slightly different format, a Parkinson-style conversation featuring a visual feast of photography with internationally celebrated photographer John Gollings. From his photographs as a young boy with a Box Brownie, John Gollings' career has spanned more than 50 years and taken him all over the world to capture architectural marvels. When John Gollings first picked up a camera as a young boy, he fell in love with the process of photography. He continued snapping throughout his time at the University of Melbourne, where he studied architecture during the 1960s. After graduating, he decided to pursue his self-taught hobby full-time, stepping into the world of advertising and fashion photography. His former architecture classmates gradually began to design and construct significant projects, and he became their go-to guy to get the perfect shot of their creations. His catalogue of work quickly grew to include commissions from some of the world's most recognised architects, including Glenn Murcutt and Harry Seidler. Alongside his well-known commercial work, John has had a series of career-long passion projects concerned with architectural history and heritage. This includes a significant body of work surrounding Angkor Wat in Cambodia, various locations in India, and incredible Indigenous sites in Australia. It is an immense pleasure to introduce John Gollings in conversation tonight with Tania, Davidge, Chief Curator of Open House, and I'd like to invite them both up on stage. And please welcome John and Tania.
Oh,
It's very bright up here.
it is very bright up here. How do you feel, John?
Touch nervous.
Touch nervous? Well, I suppose your renowned photography career has spanned over 60 years, and I did ask the Victorian Heritage Council whether they might not pop you on the register, but they said they don't do people. But apparently the National Trust, if there's anybody out there, does people in some way, shape or form, so maybe they'll have to consider it. I think it would be gorgeous. I think I'd like to start with my favourite photo of you at 12 years old. I look at this wonderful energy that you've got then, and I still see the energy that you have now. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this lovely photograph.
It was a Christmas day and I proudly wore every single bit of equipment I own. And I discovered my father's camera when I was about 9 years old and fell in love with photography, to the point where my hobby was to read the price lists at the back of Popular Photography magazine. I was a complete nerd. And I lusted after a 35mm camera, which I finally got. It's around my neck in that photograph. And it just developed this lifelong passion for initially the technology of photography. It was later that I discovered I inherently had an eye for composition, which I've expanded on in my career. But yeah, I became a school photographer.
And you were taking some incredible photos through your teenage years. We've got the Duke of Edinburgh and Robert Menzies here. What kind of photographer did you want to be?
I guess that's how I wanted to be Cartier-Bresson. I thought that the act of seizing the moment was crucial to the act of photography. And so to get a chance to photograph even Bob Menzies, I was very happy with that particular moment, striding forward, and the Duke of Edinburgh was actually getting out of his car. I prided myself on seizing the moment. Later on, it was seizing the subject matter.
Fantastic. But even though you had an interest in photography very early on, you didn't go on initially to be a photographer, did you?
No, I loved architecture as well, but I was meant to be the architect in the family building firm. And so I'd won a Commonwealth Scholarship and I got accepted into architecture school at Melbourne University. And there I am in the studio. And
Making a model?
Alan Powell, in fact, is there in his woolly jumper on the far right-hand side.
Looking very handsome.
Yep.
And what's the model of?
The first year project was to do a kindergarten, and we laboured over the balsa wood and the glue, and we were all there comparing each other's kindergarten. Mine was fairly conventional, others were starting to do much more expansive, interesting designs.
Did you enjoy studying architecture?
Yeah, I loved it. It was an extraordinary group of people. We were the class of 64, and that class of 64 has gone on to produce a lot of great architects, and they became friends at the same time.
Fantastic. And you had a bit of a side hustle though.
Well, I was very lucky. I had a friend, Adrian Rawlins, who was a Melbourne poet, and Adrian had been communicating with Bob Dylan for a long time. So in those days, Bob came down from Sydney and landed at Essendon Airport, and you could just go out on the runway. So we wandered out. And again, putting that approach into practice of trying to seize the moment. I tracked backwards with Bob Dylan being interviewed, and it's become a pretty nice historic shot.
Oh, I wonder, is your mic, do you want to just test your mic for a second there?
Does that help?
Oh yeah, no, how we go.
Okay.
There we go. I think you just cut out for a second. How about Mick Jagger?
Mick Jagger, a friend of mine, Rosie Ham, was going out with Keith Richards in London.
As you do.
And so when they arrived in Melbourne, she said, let's come to lunch. And her father, Max Ham, who was boss of Mallison's, the law firm at the time, decided that he would cook the barbecue, and Mick's got his sausage. And again, this quite surreal shot is where the sausage is substituted for the microphone is a real favourite shot of mine.
It's fantastic. I love it. Both of those images are incredible. But I suppose let's just go back a little bit to that class, that architecture class you were studying with. Who were your teachers and your contemporaries at the time?
Hugh O'Neill was my first year master, and Hugh went on to play a very big part in my life because he was an Asianist. And he took me around the world quite a few times, and a lot of work in Indonesia with Hugh O'Neill. Neville Quarry, who was instrumental in getting me up to New Guinea for some projects we'll cover. Peter McIntyre became a mentor and would turn up to our year every year to talk about the Architecture Review. Yes, it was, and to this day we're still having class reunions.
I think we've even got Maggie in there.
We have.
Right in the centre, don't we? Which is really lovely. And what was it like to kind of study in the 60s? What was it about this generation?
We were part of that youth revolution in the 60s that came down from Carnaby Street, I guess. It was the first time my parents' generation were impacted by the Depression, and they worked hard, and there was no time for frivolity in their life. We were the first generation to be given credit as really young people to be in charge of big projects. And it was a fundamental shift. I don't think the current generation have that approval to go for it like we did.
Yeah, it was a very optimistic period, a lot of different things going on. But however, you did get sidetracked from studying architecture. And Rennie Ellis, who later became... hang on again.
Good.
Oh, now you've got
Been
two.
swapped.
Nice one. Well, we have to be able to hear you. It's not that important to hear me.
I had met Rennie socially.
Yep.
And Rennie was a copywriter in those days, working for Philip Adams at Monahan Damon Adams. And in fact, this photograph is Rennie talking at my 50th birthday party. We became firm friends, but Rennie in turn introduced me into the advertising world, and that was proving to be very seductive because I was getting to meet the professional photographers of Melbourne. And I've always made a policy of saying yes to everything in my life. And in my fourth year of architecture, Rennie introduced me to a chap called Kevin Orpin, and Kevin had just employed Peter Goff, who was Norman Parkinson's assistant in London, and Peter had come to Melbourne with his wife Dawn Scott, and he had asked for a car and an assistant. And Kevin, of course, a week before Peter started work, hadn't got an assistant, but had met me and knew that I loved photography. So I said yes to becoming Peter's assistant, deferred from university, and started work as an advertising photographer.
And of course, there wasn't social media in those days. So how did you promote yourself?
Well, Peter got sick of me after about 2 months. He didn't really need an assistant. So the studio decided to put me out to work. So they came back to Rennie and commissioned Rennie to write the copy for a poster. And in fact, Rennie took that photograph. And it was sent out to every ad agency in Melbourne, and along with invitations to show my portfolio. And I, again, with a combination of incredible luck, met some really brilliant art directors who taught me a lot about photography and choosing the great picture. And one of them, Barton Gold, had just done a week's photography on the Marlboro cigarette campaign, and he rang me up and said, look, I was quite impressed with your portfolio. We've had a disaster with a big major shoot. Kurt Veld, the photographer, had worked for a week, taken hundreds of rolls of film. He got the exposure wrong, and when they'd finally got the film processed, decided there wasn't a single shot in the picture. So he offered me $200 to spend a day reshooting a Marlboro campaign, and that campaign got 3 24-sheet billboards on Kingsway, and that really set my career off as an advertising photographer.
And what was the brief for that?
The brief was the best brief I've ever had in my life. I was embarrassed at the original Marlboro photography. They had a guy with a blonde and a Porsche car, and I decided, and of course cigarette smoking. So I went and spoke to Andre Wist, who was the marketing manager, and said, can I play around with this campaign imagery? And they said, look, you can drop the car and you can drop the blonde. We don't really care what you come back with as long as it has status and masculinity. And that was the best brief I've ever had in my life.
I think you rocked the brief there. It's a beautiful shot. You went on to work in fashion photography. You did amazing campaigns for really iconic Australian brands such as Levante, Sports Girl, Jag. You also worked in travel and tourism photography. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this shot here.
One of the great and intriguing campaigns was the Get Wrecked on Great Keppel campaign, which I shot for about 5 years. It required me to come up with narratives, with ideas to encourage young people to go to Keppel. They didn't want married couples. You had to be young. You had to be single, in fact.
How far we've come.
And at the same time, I realised that what gave credibility to a photograph was a strong composition. And I just loved working with all the platonic solids. In this case, we've got the triangle and we've got the vertical line. And we've got a compelling frozen moment as well. And this became one of the great enthusiastic posters for Great Keppel.
It's fantastic. Probably the slogan "Get Wrecked" on Great Keppel wouldn't really fly these days, but it's an incredible image. So what were you kind of learning, I suppose, about in terms of fashion and advertising? What was it teaching you about photography?
It was teaching me two things. I had to build a narrative. There had to be some rationale coming out of the photo because I was trying to sell product and sell goods. I also realised that one of the skills that one needed was to freeze a moment in time. The other one was to form a really good composition. But the other one was to simply find subject matter that was fascinating.
And so in terms of that fascinating subject matter, you weren't only working on fashion and tourism at the time, you were also starting to travel and take photographs in other places, and you went to Papua New Guinea. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that came about and what you photographed there.
It came about because Neville Quarry, who was my second-year master and went on to be a great architectural educator in Sydney, Neville had been made head of the architecture school in Lae in New Guinea, and he was employing my classmates like Tony Stiant-Brown to go up and teach with him. And they naturally said, why don't you come up? And because I always said yes to every offer of a job, not only a job but a trip, I went up to Lae and stayed at the university and met the students. And the students said, look, there's a great sing-sing about to happen in Mount Hagen. Why don't you come up to our village in Hagen, move into the police hut, you can live there, and then you can document all the dance and decoration of our village, and we'll introduce you to other villages. And that started a 3-year process of going up and down to New Guinea, documenting all the dance and decoration. And of course, I now realise that it was the first of what I'd call lost civilisations that I photographed, and many of them became dead cities. But in New Guinea's case, it was people.
Yeah, they're incredible, beautiful images, really evocative. After New Guinea, you head to India. Can you tell us what happened there?
This was in 1980. George Michel, a friend of mine, had got his PhD at SOAS in London, and he was working as an Indiologist. And he was back in Australia. We'd gone to school together in Brighton, ironically. Anyway, he came back and we were talking. I said, I'd love to go to India. And he said, the big mistake people make is trying to do all of India at once. You should just come and do one place. Why don't you come to this place I've just discovered, Vijayanagar? He said, Indian scholars don't like it because it's got mixed Indo-Islamic architecture, but I think it's fantastic and no one's done any study on it. So I said yes and got on a plane and ended up in the village of Hampi in Vijayanagar. Ironically, one of the first people, they're in this photo of this John Guy from New York, and is Peter Lovell on the right-hand side. Peter came and was one of the historic architecture advisors.
I had not imagined Peter in shorts like that before I saw this image, John.
It's a fantastic photograph. It's pure 80s.
Yeah. Most excellent. Yeah. I'm loving it.
It was the start of a great friendship with Peter that continues to this day.
And a well-known heritage architect as well.
In the middle is a chap...
Sorry, I'll go back.
Peter White, who was my first employee and my first assistant, and Peter tagged along. And Peter was incredibly handy because he was an expert at lighting with multiple flash guns. I was dragging these big, powerful battery-operated flash guns. I decided to light the buildings at Vijayanagara at night for a technical reason. The early photographs taken in India were taken on blue-sensitive film, blue-sensitive film. And so the sky went white and the shadows were opened up and overexposed. When I got there shooting on panchromatic film, tonally the density of the stone in the building and the blue sky were identical, and you just got this grey mush. So I decided to photograph all the buildings at Vijayanagara, if not in colour in the middle of sunshine. I would do it at night. And Peter went around, we opened the camera, there's a big view camera in these days. Peter went around and lit every single one of these elephant stables and then got up on the roof and lit all the domes as well.
They're fantastic.
Yeah,
How long did that?
It took about an hour to make that single exposure. And again, it's one of the shots I'm most proud of.
It's beautiful. It's incredible. I really love this shot as well. Can you talk about that one?
This was, it's called the Lotus Mahal. It was the palace for the king's harem. Again, it was responding well with this beautiful tree to night lit flash. But again, I want to build the narrative and tie it back to India. And so I paid the farmer with his bullock cart. I remember I paid him 10 rupees to stand there while we went around and flashed that whole building. In fact, I used to sleep on the top floor of this building right through the 80s until it was banned.
Not allowed to do that anymore, I would imagine. And there's a kind of a narrative element in that, isn't there?
We're still putting it in, and of course it translated later on into a lot of my architectural work.
Can you talk about these?
Yes, I worked with a fantastic illustrator slash graphic designer, come art director, David, having a complete mental, David Lancashire, who's actually in the audience tonight. We had a commission to photograph every Oberoi hotel in the world, which was fantastic because it got me back to India a few times where I could then go and do my work on Vijayanagara. But the Jindal Steel Company decided that they would build a museum to house my life's work, which opened in 2015, I think. And David Lancashire was the designer, and so I put this photograph on the right-hand side, has all the best work that I've done over 30 years at Vijayanagara.
And we can see some of the photographs.
All done by David Lancashire.
That's beautiful. So you were kind of building a bit of a reputation as a photographer that would go to exotic places and do the hard yards.
Yep.
What did you do in Indonesia?
The Asia Society in New York had sent a photographer out to photograph for the Festival of Indonesia all the crown jewels. And he had gone from New York to one of the islands and completely freaked out and ran back to America. Said he just couldn't cope with the jungle. So I was run by the Asia Society and a friend, Helen Jessup, who was a wonderful Indonesianist. And we had this commission to go to every island of Indonesia and photograph all the crown jewels, which is mainly Chris's, and you can see the from the catalogue called The Court Arts of Indonesia. It was a year-long project. Hugh O'Neill took over at one stage because he knew the protocols for going to some of the very distant villages, and he would buy a bit of dope for them and give to the head man and generally bribe people into letting me photograph these very sacred objects. So that was a year-long trip through every island.
I'm learning some things I didn't know just up here, which is really wonderful. This led, I suppose, to you being invited. You travelled in 1990 to Cambodia with Dr. Michael Brandt, who was the senior curator for Asian art at the National Gallery of Australia at the time.
Yep.
What did you do in Cambodia?
It was a remarkable offer. Gareth Evans was Australia's foreign minister at the time, and he had orchestrated the Paris peace talks, which brought Hun Sen to power. And Hun Sen was so in love with the openness of Australians that brought him to power that he offered the first ever travelling exhibition of Khmer art to come to the National Gallery in Canberra. And I guess partly because of my reputation, and Michael had been a friend of mine, I was asked to go with Michael to Phnom Penh, which had just been liberated from Pol Pot, with instructions. They had hidden all the treasures in the museum in the basement. So we had instructions to break open the basement, choose whatever objects we like, go upstairs, build a photographic studio. I had to go and hire a Honda generator to drive the Belcar flash guns. My assistant, ironically, was Nonda Katsoulides, the Melbourne architect, who was bored with architecture at that moment, and like me, always said yes to everything. So when I said I needed someone to help, he jumped in and worked with me for a week in Phnom Penh. And we photographed all these objects, which became a big exhibition in Canberra. Some of the most remarkable, like the head of Javayam and the wonderful reclining Buddha from the Melbourne. And DFAT, to their credit, decided that they would continue to print the catalogue that was for the Canberra exhibition and donate it to the National Museum in Phnom Penh, and the proceeds from that sale afforded the Australians a chance to rebuild the Phnom Penh Museum, National Museum, and get rid of the bats in the roof, all due to the proceeds of the catalogue.
Fantastic. Now, Nonda went home, didn't he?
Nonda went home to bid on an auction for the Hyatt Hotel site, which he lost.
Well, he's come a long way since. But you stayed in Cambodia. What did you do?
I was sent up then to Siem Reap, which had just been liberated from Pol Pot. It was still mined, so I was told to only follow a cow on an animal track because they'd been blown up before and I'd be fairly safe. And I was the only person in Angkor Wat. I was paid $20 a night to stay in the hotel, and I met had been the ex-chief of police who'd been jailed the whole of Pol Pot's regime. He said, "I'll drive you around." He bought an old Toyota and he had a Colt 45 tucked in his waistband. And he took me around the whole of the Angkor Grand Tour. And I got the most amazing shots, all on 5.4 camera, loading film in the dark in the hotel at night. But I got shots that you just can't replace anymore.
That's amazing. So this is a shot of the Bayon Temple. How did you get this shot?
This was extraordinary. I'd met a young French architect who'd gone to Paris to get her degree and come back, and she knew the governor of Siem Reap province. And I was telling him that I really wanted to get some aerial photographs. And he said, "Look, we do have a little bomber at our disposal." And they cut a hole in the back of the tail and put me in the back there. And they flew round and round all the Cambodian temples with me hand-holding a 35mm camera. And this is one of these great and now very difficult to get photographs of the Bayon.
It's fantastic. And this one of the Ta Prohm Temple?
Ironically, one of Gareth Evans' favourite shots. Unrepeatable now because UNESCO in their wisdom said that it had to be made wheelchair accessible, so the Cambodians built a wheelchair ramp right across those famous routes. That's an original shot.
I've got to think about where we put things. But I'm also glad it's wheelchair accessible.
Yep.
And this is an incredibly beautiful shot, another one of the Bayon Temple.
And it's got a compositional strength. There happened to be rain that day, and so it filled up one of the pools. So, I mean, reflection shots are a bit of a cliche, but this one particularly worked. And it worked because two things. It's made from multiple exposures. I decided to cope with the threatening storm by underexposing it. And I took one frame, then I took another frame, and the sun came out and lit the tops of the... and now I put it all together in Photoshop.
It's beautiful. And these early cultural projects are, the foundation of your interest, I suppose, in dead cities or lost cities. And can you speak to...
I also practiced photographing architecture. A dead city is wonderful because there's no flashy colour, there's no mirrors, there's no glass, there's no steel. It is just a pure architectural form, and to do that you have to really understand how to compose the single best shot of it. So I practice my skills on dead cities.
Mm-hmm. And I think, what are some of the other lessons you've learned from photographing these places?
Say yes to everything for a start.
Yeah.
try to describe for the viewer in the most succinct way you can the excitement of it. And you do that with strong composition and a chosen time of day.
And do you feel these cities have any lessons for us now?
They have a massive... Well, the big lesson is that no civilization lasts forever. That they can last for a few hundred years, maybe 1,000 years. But ultimately, every civilization collapses, possibly through arrogance. Angkor Wat was due to climate change. They ran out of water and had to shift the capital. Vijayanagara was lost militarily. They got arrogant and stopped defending it, and they lost in a big battle in 1556. After that, the invaders decided to completely demolish this extraordinary city. They were a bit scared of the Hindu gods, so they left the temples, and the temples are now World Heritage Sites, which I'd been photographing. So, yes, look, one could argue that ultimately we are all doomed, and I really worry about the decline of the American empire at the moment and the rise of Asian empires.
So we need to think about climate change, and we need to be careful of hubris.
Exactly, totally.
Excellent. I think they're very, very good lessons. In terms of honing your craft, you talked a little bit about honing your craft on these like dead cities, but you were also kind of starting to work on, I suppose, more contemporary architectural projects. And I was wondering if you could tell to us a little bit about this image of Frank Lloyd Wright's Sturgis House, because it's quite important to you.
I had been asked to go to Los Angeles to meet with Bill Mitchell, who was teaching at UCLA and had been at Melbourne University a couple of years ahead and was a friend. So while I was there, and I was still fascinated by architecture, and I was realising that a lot of my income was coming from photographing buildings. So I bought the LA Guide to Architecture and got in a car and just drove around for 2 weeks photographing all the mid-century modern houses. This one, the Sturgis House, the owner invited me in. I mean, I arrogantly, cheekily knocked on his front door and said, "Hi, I'm from Melbourne. Can I photograph your house?" And he said yes. And I got some great shots of it, but when I came outside, it was this particular angle from the street. And I took this photograph and realised that I had identified a great way to photograph architecture that really suited my style. I hated blue sky and green grass. By shooting backlight, I'd got rid of the blue sky, I got white stuff. I also discovered the love of putting the sort of incongruous vertical elements bisecting the image, and I just liked the fact that it distracted from it being a patently architectural shot. It had other qualities apart from describing the content. So this I consider my first really successful architectural photograph, and I've followed most of its dictums ever since.
I think we can see that already actually coming through in some of the...
It's got a central element, it's got a vertical element, it's got a diagonal element, it's got the lot.
It does have the lot. So moving us all the way back to Australia now, from all over the world, many of your contemporaries were starting to build names for them, starting to win work here in Melbourne. This is an incredible photograph. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about this.
This is really my contemporaries and my generation, and I think all of us are within 10 years of each other in age. It was the opening of Tarawara, and I have to say every one of the people in this photograph is both a contemporary and a client and a friend, and I don't think there's any collective group of Melburnians that work like this particular generation. It's an amazing image.
Yeah, it's incredible, the kind of level of impact that these people have had in terms of shaping our city is really quite amazing to think about. And now I think we're going to start to have a look at a little bit of the work that you were doing for them at the time. This is definitely one of my favourites. So how were you starting to define yourself as an architectural photographer?
Well, I was still curious and interested in building a narrative to put into architectural photographs. My contemporaries were Mark Strizik and Wolfgang Sievers and Max Dupain and David Moore, who took classic, beautifully composed black and white pictures. I suppose at the back of my mind was that I had to break into it somehow, and so I decided to shoot in colour and shoot pictures that were loaded with more information than the building itself had. So this amazing opportunity came from Peter Corrigan, who rang up one day and said, John, Domus have asked me to submit this building, and I've sent some snaps over and they've rejected them and said, get a real photographer. So would I photograph his K Street housing? Now, it just happened at the time I was the official photographer for Melbourne Zoo. So I gave myself permission to chase kangaroos around the zoo at night with a flash gun and took a whole series of stock shots of kangaroos on the theory that if it was to be published in Milan, wouldn't it be great if the Italians realised that we had kangaroos instead of dogs and cats on our street? So that was the origin of this photograph. It was to entertain the Italians. And it's gone on to become a fairly significant photograph within my oeuvre.
And a fairly significant piece of architecture. I think it's just been listed on the Heritage Register as well. How did the Italians find the kangaroos?
They loved it, yeah. It's published in Domus.
Of course they did. So you did some work with Harry Seidler. This is the Waverley Civic Centre.
Yep.
What was it like to work with Harry, and what did you learn from him?
I learnt the biggest lesson in my life. Harry was great to work with and very intelligent, and I think one of the best architects of his generation. And still his buildings stand up really well. I took this as a Polaroid and showed it to him, and I was very proud of having identified the significant entry. And Harry looked at it on the Polaroid and said, this is a completely incompetent photograph. Don't you ever take a photograph like this for me ever again. I said, what's wrong? And he said, I can't see the rest of the building. He said, it might go on for another 100 yards. You must always photograph the whole building. And I've never stopped that bit of advice.
So you did?
So I got that, and Harry loved it. The other important fact was that later that day I took a picture of a great sunset and sent him a transparency up. And he said, that's pointless, don't ever photograph sunsets on Harry Seidler building. He said, that's an occasional bit of light. It's not regular light. I want my viewers to see a building as I designed it in its everyday condition. And that condition was that I had to photograph his buildings at 12 o'clock when the sun was at its peak, because that showed his buildings work, what he called working. That he just very carefully designed the windows to be shaded, so you didn't need Venetian blinds, you didn't need curtains. So he explained his whole rationale for his very simple approach to photography of his buildings, but especially he had to show the whole building. And I've never not shown the whole building ever since.
Beautiful. This one looks like a rather innocuous image, but there's a big lesson learned here.
There are a lot of things. DCM had finally won a competition to do number 1 Collins Street. The developer was Jack Chia, who had invented Tiger Balm. And the first little picture was was meant to be the great hero shot, but they wanted a picture of Jack associated, but Jack had gone back to Singapore. So I grabbed the bust from his office and took it out into Spring Street and sat it down and lit Jack Chia at first, and then turned the lights off on Jack and did the big time exposure on the DCM building in the background.
Beautiful.
But again, I learnt another very important architectural lesson. I'd been photographing the interior of Jack's office in number 1 Collins Street, and one of them had a pot plant in the corner. And I proudly took this interior photograph into John Denton. He said, you've got to go back and reshoot it. DCM does not do pot plants. And to this day, I take out every pot plant, an indoor plant, and also the rugs from under tables to get the purest version of an architectural interior. So that was lesson number 2.
Very hard not to photograph a pot plant at the moment, I would imagine. They're quite popular. This is just such a beautiful image. Could you talk about the story and the narrative behind this one?
I'd been visiting Roy Ground's house because I knew Victoria Grounds, his daughter. But it suddenly struck me that, in fact, it was the prototype for the NGV redevelopment. And so I set out to take a picture of Grounds Hill Street house. And again, in those days, having no compunction about relighting the architect's intent, I lit it to demonstrate the power of that large blank wall and then the clerestory lighting above it. It was also important to me because I knew the owners that I had the front door open, because having a front door open means I was invited to take the photograph. And it's a lesson you learn as an architect. It's very easy to rock up to a building and go click without permission, but to have control of the lighting and to have the front door open meant I was accepted. Equally, the top of the roof is the horizon running through the middle of the photograph. There's a central tree, so it's still complying with all those compositional elements that I think make a strong photograph.
And I love the way it speaks across the body of his work.
Yep.
As well, from the residential to the very large public buildings.
Yep. No, it's an important little descriptor.
Okay. And this one here?
Well, this was all my lessons coming together from the Sturgis House in Los Angeles. A backlit photograph is an incredibly efficient photograph because you can see inside and outside at the same time. So this is Merkett's Kempsey house. You can look right inside it. Again, the composition is strong with a central horizon. The house is on the crosshairs of the viewfinder. I left the green grass because I didn't know what other colour to take it, but I've got a white sky. And this again is a very important photograph to me, demonstrating efficiency, if nothing else.
It's incredibly beautiful. I always thought of your images, actually, I always imagined them with blue skies, but it was really interesting for me to find out that you're not a fan.
I now photograph storm skies where possible.
Fantastic.
Anything to get rid of the blue.
So many, many lessons learned, honing the craft of architecture through these incredible projects. But how do you know when you've made it in architectural photography, John?
When you've got the biggest building in Australia to photograph, basically. I was the main photographer on Parliament House for about 5 years. To his credit, Harry Seidler owned an apartment in Yarralumla, which he gave to me free for those 5 years, so I could stay there. I had a key, I just went and stayed there whenever I liked. His sister-in-law, Elizabeth Everett, was also staying there, so sometimes we'd clash in the middle of the night. That was always fun. And yes, I documented it, I got to know it quite well, and of course on opening day I had my assistant, I'd given him instructions on what lens to use to photograph the fact that you could walk up on top of Parliament House, also to show the crowd at the opening. At the same time I was downstairs waiting for the Queen to arrive because I had to photograph the Queen actually opening it.
And this is a great photo of you.
With all our press passes. The Queen took so long to arrive that all the photographers, and I knew a lot of them, got bored, so we photographed each other. And this is
So another way you know you've made it as well is when you get photographed by a relatively famous portraitist.
Yeah, and this is Heidi Smith's, and Heidi Smith, in fact, the opening shot that was up on the screen when you walked into the theatre.
Fantastic. So that's the way you know you've made it number 2.
Yeah.
Maybe this is the way you know you've made it number 3.
There is the Queen, and ironically, you can see the little red circle where the Queen, it was quite a push. I finally got there and got the Queen signing all the opening documents. But to my amazement, I was then in 2011, I was commissioned to photograph the Queen in Melbourne, and she had the same pink outfit on.
So not a fan of fast fashion, which is good to hear. I think that's fantastic. It's very open house pink as well, just put that out there. I think what's really interesting for me sitting up here with you is so many of the ways that I know Melbourne buildings and Australian architecture is through your images. As we've mentioned, you've photographed some of the most, the works of some of the most kind of important Melbourne architects, and your photographs are also some of the most iconic photographs of those architects' architecture. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of them, or quite a lot of them actually. So I hope you're all still interested. But we've got the Connemara House, Horse Stud.
Yep, Daryl Jackson's Shoreham house, which they still have. What's been important to me is to, in the ideal world, to only take 2 pictures, one perfect interior and one perfect exterior. And in fact, with the exception of the first publication of a project, when someone brings up wanting a picture of a house or a building, they just want one picture. So my mission is to get that one definitive shot. In this case, a lot of things came to pass. Daryl wanted a front cover for his first book of projects. And I decided again to work at night and to work with flash. Tim Jackson, who's now an excellent architect in his own right from JCB, was at that stage riding the Connemara horses. So I opened this large 5x7 camera and with a series of exposures we lit the big tree, and you can see there's a vertical element and basically there's a black horizontal line, so it's got all the compositional elements that I love. And then the stables we lit separately, they're on the left hand side. I fluked this shot of the horse dissolving into the tree trunk, so it was just enough horse stud. And Daryl's house across the bridge on the right hand side. And this became the definitive front cover shot for Daryl, amongst a lot of work for Daryl.
And Tim's on the horse.
And Tim's on the horse.
I wonder if Tim's got children who are going to become architects as well. He's almost obliged to, I would imagine.
He was a great horseman.
This is the Uluru Cartajuda Cultural Centre by Greg Burgess. It's incredibly iconic image.
It was pretty important to show the relationship to the cultural centre to the rockers' inspiration. It was also important to demonstrate the anthropomorphic qualities of Indigenous architecture. They had briefed Greg on what they wanted this building to be, and I had to demonstrate it from the air. There were no helicopters at that stage, so I jumped into Cessna, which takes forever to work because you've got to put the window up and you've got to rely on the slipstream to hold it out, and you've got to shoot backwards because there's a strut on the Cessna 172. So we went round and round this building for nearly 2 hours until I finally got the right height, the right elevation, and got the definitive shot. But this has actually come off a little bit of 35mm colour negative.
Fantastic. You've also photographed public housing for Peter Elliott. I think this one recently won the Enduring Architecture Award, the Maggie Edmund Enduring Architecture Award for the Victorian Institute of Architects chapter.
Yep. These are the original photographs of Knox Slap. And I can't help, the kids came out, and so I always put the kids to work and get them climbing on the tree, on the frame, which just energised the photograph. Later in Photoshop, I duplicated a couple of the kids to make more. But
it's got a little bit of the Shining action to it there, John.
It's a quick shorthand way of...
I can't unsee the fact that the little girl's like the little girl now.
And there's two blokes and someone else, yeah.
It's beautiful. That's a great image of that project, and it's an incredible project. There's also this kind of interest in the elevation in a lot of your work. Yep. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
It's the quickest way to get to what the architect had in his head, because that's how he drew it up on the drawing board in the first place. It was certainly my generation. Now, of course, it's all CAD and all over the place. But it's not a cheap trick. It's a quite difficult trick at times to get the whole elevation in. And in this case, it's very simple. So equally backlit. So I get my white sky so the building forms come out. The road was a necessary component of the composition, so it gets selected and desaturated, and you put a bit of blur on it so you don't get distracted by the potholes in the road. So there's a lot of post-production that's gone into this shot.
A lot of storytelling that goes into the work, which I think is really, really fascinating. And this next shot is one of those single image shots, isn't it?
Yeah,
really?
And Acca's quite hard to shoot. The corten still soaks up the light. This required an extremely long exposure. It was done on film, on colour negative, and then you scan it and optimise it. I do like the way it drops off. That's a characteristic of the lens. It's cosine law drop off, it's called, so it's dodging and burning the sky for me. And again, the building is smack through the middle of the composition. And again, it's the power of the composition which gives credibility to the image.
It's a really strong piece of architecture and a strong piece of photography.
These I love because the shot on the left, in fact, is an architectural cross-section, and I think it's a very good explanation of how ARM rejigged the whole entryway, and though working at night I could show how it worked. It's probably ARM's best, most sophisticated and subtle work. I think that the 4 entryways that they inserted are absolutely brilliant, and ARM can be a bit dodgy at times.
So I saw Ian the other day, and he's got a T-shirt. I'm going to make him a T-shirt with that on it, because he will love it. And the Shrine is an incredible building. I actually agree with you. I think it's an incredibly sophisticated work, and the Shrine's 90 years young this year. So I think it's a lovely one to include. I love both of these images and the way the old relates to the new. You've done a lot of work for Fender Catzelitis.
Yep.
This is particularly interesting in terms of what you were thinking about when you took this shot, or before you took this shot. Can you speak to that?
I spent a week working with Ansel Adams in California about the same time I was doing the Sturgis house, and he was absolutely brilliant and incredibly open and taught me all his darkroom work. But the thing that he told me 2 things. You put the leg of your tripod to face the building, which is something I've never been able to turn the tripod around now. It has to point to the building. But he taught me about pre-visualisation, and he said he worked out in his head the night before every single picture he ever took. And I did pre-visualisation on this. I decided to invert Eureka. I wanted to play with the golden top, which I thought was the sexiest bit of the building. And I thought the strong way to do it was to shoot with a wide-angle lens and, in fact, have the building cartooned. And so I jumped in a helicopter with John Acott, who at that stage was my pilot of preference for about 20 years. And we went round and round for about an hour waiting for the sun to set and the golden light to get more rich. And this was the final definitive shot, which again has become the hero shot of Eureka.
Absolutely, and you're in that shot a little bit too, aren't you?
Yeah, it's a reflection of me hanging out of the helicopter, which I don't do anymore.
Yeah, that's probably a good thing for all of us, I think. This is a great shot of the Lions RMIT.
Kerry Lyons. Again, it's a quick way to get a strong shot is to work at dusk on architecture, especially a big commercial job, where I wanted to show how it integrated itself into the earlier buildings on the street corner and was all linked. A quick way was to work at dusk. In fact, this is made up of 4 different exposures. A lot of my work is now digitally post-produced. It was still a building site, so again, we selected Swanson Street and desaturated it and ran a bit of blur on it to stop the eye going to look at all the construction. The dark grey sky was put in, and then the long exposure of nighttime was also dropped in. But you end up with this wonderful collage which hones the building, basically.
It strikes me looking at all of these images that Melbourne architects are quite mad, which I love. Do you have thoughts on that?
We've definitely been more experimental and braver. Sydney's been quite sedate. Sydney is getting a little bit better. Melbourne's probably overdone it to a certain extent. I think the northern cluster of brightly coloured glass towers is not our best aspect. But equally, we've produced some of the most exciting work in Australia. And I think it's due to people who've come out of both Melbourne and RMIT architecture schools. There's always been an emphasis on creativity, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of personality, I think, in the work. And I think your photography reflects that. It's really quite
I guess because I know the architects quite well, and I know their personality, so you sort of guess, you take a picture.
Is that something you think about when you...
Yes, you do, yeah.
That might segue us into this one. This is the Holocaust Museum by Kirsten Thompson. This is a really fantastic shot of this. This is near my house, actually.
I think it's an incredible piece of architecture. A brilliant integration of the earlier building into this facade, and then playing with planes of different composition and different brickwork. Again, shot at night. This is actually shot on a drone to get absolutely dead centre. And yeah, I just, again, it's another elevation, but it's just the perfect description of it, and a sense of going inside and a sense of lightness, which I think is apt for a Holocaust museum, which could have been handled very differently. I think Kirsten's done brilliantly on this.
Yeah, and that's the way she speaks about it, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Trying to kind of give it a sense of lightness in amongst the brevity of the project.
No,
and so it's captured the personality of the building, it's captured her personality.
Yeah, no, it's a shot I just keep coming back to. I'm really pleased. And of course, it's got all the compositional power, the central light atrium. Again, is that central element in the photograph.
Absolutely, and it's a tough one to get because that street is very tight.
It took all my drone skills and some particular lenses.
Excellent. This is probably one of your most well-known house shots. It's the Klein Bottle House.
Rob says it's the most published one. For some reason, it was shot on 35mm, and I didn't have perspective correcting lenses, so it's actually shot on a 12mm lens. The only purpose I'm saying that is that a lot of students are told that, yes, you can shoot with your wide angle and you must be perspective correct, and then you chop off the bottom because you don't need it. But I think it's adding, there's this yin-yang composition. So it's a straight wide angle shot, and I just love the foreground. But of course the power, again, working at twilight, you're getting to look inside the building as well. So again, it's another one of these efficient photographs.
And the balance is really beautiful. Yeah. I think I just threw these in because I love them. Or I'll let you keep them, because John had a lot of photographs in this presentation.
Again, it's elevation, which is my starting point. The Rob McBride building, he was told that he had to respect the Federation qualities in the street. So, of course, he did a cross-section of Federation, a genius interpretation of Federation architecture. And it's the cover of my book. And the other one is Nonda's Beach House at St Andrews. And it's just the perfect, well, again, it's a little square block smack in the middle of the crosshairs. The horizon goes through the middle. It almost frames itself up. It took itself, that photograph.
I think it was my favourite house when I was an architecture student, and I only knew it through your photography, which I realised.
And of course, it was nestled on a sand bed, which his wife made him put grass down. That really killed the building.
Clients, what can you do? This is a really beautiful shot of John Wardle's cottage.
Again, this is me not wanting to have blue sky, and it was threatening a storm. But I've now learnt it, because Melbourne weather's pretty unpredictable. I now embrace the difficulties, and so I photograph the storm sky and I make it more stormy. And this, in fact, there are a lot of visitors to the house on this day, and I took something like 20 or 30 different exposures until I could cut and paste all the people out, with the exception of John walking through the shot. And at that moment, the sun came out and just lit the back end of Captain Kelly's cottage. So this is a compilation of 20 or 30 photographs to get this one singular image and a portrait of John, which adds scale and narrative as well.
It's beautiful.
So nothing's complex anymore. Everything is complex now.
Including Melbourne weather,
yeah,
which we've just discovered this past weekend. But we love to embrace the weather, so I love this photo. Talk to us about this one.
Well, it seems that every architect at a certain point has to have a vineyard, and this is Nonda Katsalides' vineyard.
Finally, I'm waiting for mine.
This is a remarkable piece of architecture. This is the house on the Mount Monument vineyard side. Reputedly, Nonda found this bit of Corten steel, that wasn't Corten at that stage, in a junkyard. It was the broken beam from the King Street Bridge in Melbourne that fell down. Anyway, Nonda's propped the beam up and then he's hung the house from it, and it works really beautifully. And so again, I had to intervene. to bring out the quality of the corten steel. I actually lit it with this golden light and a bit of gum tree sliding through it. But it's another favourite composition. I've never been able to better it.
It's gorgeous. We were talking a little bit before about the kind of singular external image and the single internal image. We haven't seen as many internal images, but this is a fantastic one. It's the Chameleon apartment by Cassandra Fahey.
Which she described as a throbbing love heart at the time. But again, it's a quite powerful and fascinating and very simple in its concept, interior shot. Ironically, this was my first ever digital capture. Someone had given me a new full-frame Canon camera. And I didn't even know how to work it, but I just went click and I got this shot. And I get the centrality of the throbbing heart in the middle is the engaging part, and it's got a quality of backlight to it as well. So, and it describes the project perfectly.
And so sometimes it takes 30 shots, and sometimes it takes...
You just get it in one, yeah.
Amazing. And this is just a fantastic shot of the Webb Bridge.
It's another one. We'd just taken off from the heliport on the Yarra River, and I was just sort of shuffling around in the seat, and I didn't have a door in the helicopter, and we just went past. And of course, it just did everything. I love backlight. Normally the Yarra River just reads as brown, and suddenly it was glistening. I love the balance of light and dark and shade and composition. To me, it all balances out, but that's an intuitive bit of composition. I can't quite describe it in any other way, but it does make a point of Barry Marshall's little red curved concrete seating, and that, of course, is the highlight of it to me, that little, again, that tiny little pulse of red.
It's stunning. What I think is really interesting about your work is the fact that you use many different modes of transport. We've got a little donkey going on, a tuk-tuk.
Yeah, Monash University sent me to document the Silk Road and Kashgar, which was timely because they've demolished the mud city of Kashgar. But everyone in Kashgar is a donkey like we have a Holden. And so I found I went to work on a donkey every day. And in India, of course, I work from the roof of a tuk-tuk all the time, and I've spent my life in a helicopter. So.
And you're really well known for your photography from the air. In fact, I think that's really enabled your love of shooting cities. And there's many, many incredible cities that you've shot. I'm just thinking back to the Now and When exhibition as well.
Yep.
With the Mayan tailings and the juxtaposed with some incredible cities. But you've shot cities like Sydney. We've obviously got the obligatory beautiful Sydney shot. The Gold Coast multiple times.
Gold Coast was an interesting one because just before that, I had walked from Paradise Point to Coolangatta and documented one shot of every single high-rise on the Gold Coast, and there's 600 of them. And that work is now in the State Library of Queensland. But in this instance, I was given away as a prize by some window company. And the prize was to go in a helicopter with John Gollings, and we took off from Brisbane. It was one of those dreadful, awful overcast days. And so I said, let's go down to the Gold Coast just to fill in time. And just as we got there, the sun came out and I went snap, and we got this amazing shot that described the project that I'd just done. So that's the story behind getting that particular one.
That's brilliant. We've also got Dubai, Shanghai, and maybe I'm going to bring you back to Melbourne now and get you to talk about this picture.
This is a fascinating picture. Jeff Kennett commissioned me to photograph a Christmas card for him for Melbourne, and he wanted it done in about 3 days. And so I thought one of my favourite spots is the roof of the Herald and Weekly Times building. So I got permission to get up there, and I set up the camera. And again, the weather turned really foul. But I thought, well, I'm here now, so, well, two things going on in my head. I held the CAD model for Fed Square for lab, and so I knew that I could render in, it was nearly finished, but I knew I could render in bits of Fed Square into the shot. And I thought, if all else fails, you take a dusk shot. So I just left the camera there and we waited. I was going to wait for dusk. And then all of a sudden, this golden light just burst out from the clouds and just hit the tips of all the high-rise buildings in Melbourne. And the grey sky started to disappear and it went blue, and I thought, this is fantastic. And I took a frame of that. And then lo and behold, a rainbow came and pointed straight down at Fed Square, and so I went snap and I got the rainbow. And then I just left the camera open and got this beautiful dusk shot, and then we put the whole lot together, and Jeff loved his Christmas card.
Because I can imagine Jeff's a bit terrifying, so pretty happy with his Christmas card. That's excellent.
It was a nerve-wracking commission, yeah.
Did you have to do another Christmas card for him?
Yeah, we did one more, yeah. It wasn't as good.
I do have a bit of a love for Fed Square, and I must admit your photographs of Fed Square are my favourites. I think now we're going to talk a little bit about Melbourne's heritage. I mean, you're not particularly well known for your Australian heritage photography, but given it's 50 years of the Victorian heritage legislation, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of your favourite Melbourne heritage buildings.
There's two things, I guess. I'm known as a wide-angle queen, and they're not that wrong. And of course, heritage buildings don't respond to optical extortion. And so you've got to be fairly careful with it. The shot of Murrumpa Gog is a simple snapshot because I fell in love with Murrumpa Gog and that environment as a kid. So that was an easy one. The shot of Mallorca House, which was actually commissioned by Maggie Edmond because her mother worked in that building, it's not easy to get the whole of that building, in fact. And so this is shot with a very wide angle. I've desaturated the surrounding buildings. I've thrown the weight onto the reconstructed foreground, and I've shot in elevation. So I've used every known modern technique and Photoshop to produce the definitive shot of Mallorca House. So there's two examples of I'm sensitive to not over-exaggerate heritage buildings. I think my style suits modern architecture, but yeah, I wouldn't recommend myself to do heritage building.
Although you did judge the Heritage Photographic Competition this year for us, which was lovely. Can you tell me about this shot?
This is one, I think it's one of the best buildings in Melbourne, certainly arguably one of the best heritage buildings in Melbourne, the Guerini Dome on 333 Collins Street. In fact, I wanted to photograph this dome, and it's quite tricky, and you can't go in with a tripod and take photographs anymore. So I went up to the security guard and said, can I have permission to lie on the middle of the floor and just point up with my iPhone? And he thought I was crazy, but he said, yeah, sure. So my iPhone took this shot. It's then had artificial intelligence run across it. It's been corrected in a million different ways, but it's now a spectacular shot that I've never seen before of the dome, but it's done with an iPhone.
I wish I could take shots like that on my iPhone. Do you know when you photograph like a new building, a contemporary building, do you get a feel for whether it might have the bones to become a heritage building?
It's the heart of a sort of developing connoisseurship of architecture, and I guess what I'm most interested in is assessing whether I'm looking at something that's intrinsically exciting, but is just fashionable and won't last the distance, and in 2 years' time will be seen as just over the top. So I'm looking for that quality that I guess you would call real style, and to do that I mentally take all the colour off a building, just in case I'm being seduced by a red wall or some bright colour. And I'm looking at the forms, and it's those forms that I've learnt from looking at dead cities that I'm looking for. So I think I could have a stab at saying this one's got legs and this one's just too over the top.
Any that spring to the top of your mind, John?
Yes, one would have to be very careful of the new Geelong Gallery theatres, because I think they're fantastic the way they've brought the drapery of a theatre onto the front facade, but possibly it's just too strong in the streetscape. I reserve judgment, but that's one that might not make the distance. I don't
Time
know.
will tell.
But a brilliant interior and brilliant bit of planning, so yeah, it's an issue for me.
Time will tell on all of these, which I think is interesting, and that is an interesting building. In terms of Australian heritage, what do you see as our true Australian heritage?
Well, this is a remarkable project, which was only discovered 6 years ago. It's now considered, and Diane Sudjik's written about it, as the world's oldest piece of architecture, and I'm thrilled that Australia has got that situation, that position. It's a rock art site that was formed by rushing water 43,000 years ago, forming these pilotis. But the Indigenous folk who settled there took out 80 columns, as Monash University would, to create a painting ceiling. And it's been continuously painted. This is the most remarkable building in Australia. Continuously painted for 46,000 years. Overpainting stopped 500 years ago. I heard about it on the ABC. I had contacts with a good friend, Edwina Carney, whose sister knew the archaeologist who discovered it, and I got in touch with him, and he said, "You've got to get in touch with Auntie Margaret, who's the sole custodian of the building," and I found Auntie Margaret in Catherine, and she said, yes, she'd love to come with us, on the only condition I take a portrait of her in her building. So that's us landing by helicopter. It's 2 hours south of Jabiru, and we landed and the helicopter took off and we were all left alone. There's a picture of me actually taking Auntie Margaret's portrait, and then we spent 3 days photographing. And there is Auntie Margaret. This picture's now on permanent exhibition in the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra. But this is Auntie Margaret with this extraordinary project, this painted ceiling that is Australia's first piece of architecture.
And what's the legacy of this portrait and your ability to get out there and photograph this site?
The legacy, I think, is promoting Indigenous art and Indigenous architecture. I plan to do more of it in the future. I think the connection to country is profound, and I feel that connection to country myself. But Auntie Margaret was brilliant. We slept and she just talked right through the night, telling us Dreamtime stories. And it was just a profound experience of the most amazing site that I've ever photographed.
It's incredible. It's quite moving, I think, to see those images, especially knowing that it's quite difficult, well, it's impossible to see this site now, isn't it?
You can't get there because Auntie Margaret died after giving me official permission to publish the photographs. And under Aboriginal moiety, custodianship can only pass to a female, and she has 2 sons who are rangers, but they're not allowed to go there. So at the moment, it's on Jawoyn land, but it's locked up. You can't get there. So these are the only known photographs of it.
That's amazing, isn't it? And I think it's really important that we're starting to connect better in this way, and it's incredibly important not just for Australia's heritage, this project, is it? It's a world.
This puts us up there with the Lascaux Caves. It's
incredible. Well, I think we've come to the end of our conversation. John, do you have anything you'd like to add? What are the stories you haven't told us this evening? Do we have to have another whole session?
Yeah, you do, because there's a million projects that we haven't. I mean, you know, you paired out a lot of shots.
Sorry, I apologise. But we had to keep it to time. Anyway,
I'm just amazed when I look back at how much work I've covered myself. It's sort of thrilling and daunting.
I think it's an incredible, I think, privilege and honour to be sitting up here on the stage with you and to look back at that body of work and the incredible varied nature of that work. I think the impact of that work in so many different spheres of Australian kind of cultural expression through kind of advertising and fashion, into kind of cultural expression and sculpture, heritage in so many different ways, like really understanding that really broad breadth of heritage, and then just how your work is incredibly interwoven into to Melbourne and Victoria, and the work of our architects and our designers. It's an incredible legacy. It's also been incredibly exciting for me to work with all those architects, because there's some
just giants of creativity, and it rubs off on me. I guess I'm encouraged to match their skill, and I guess that's what I bring to the photograph.
I think you've more than stepped up to that task, as we've seen tonight. Please join me now in thanking John for that wonderful talk.
Well, it just remains for me to thank everyone involved in bringing this event to you all here tonight. It was so fantastic to have this address in this exquisite heritage-listed theatre by Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Marnie. And I'd like to thank Tania for her outstanding discussion with John, and most of all, congratulate John for making us all view our built environment with such wonder, I think. John has, his discerning and artistic eye over the past 50 years has been a great gift, and John is, I think, a national treasure. So please join with me again in thanking Tania and John. And we've got one last moment for Tania to officially close Open House Melbourne for 2024. So, Tania.
Thank you all for coming. This is our last event of our 2024 weekend, and we've had such a glorious weekend. John spoke about the weather, and I do love the way we embrace it here in Melbourne. At Open House Melbourne, we're a tiny team. Pierre, Katie, Georgia, Ellen are my team, and they've delivered an incredible weekend. Without them, none of this is possible. They're amazing. So please thank them if you see them on the way out. And we couldn't present our program without the support of our Open House community, our partners and our sponsors, particularly eFront, who have done our incredible identity yet again. They've topped themselves for another year. Studio Pain have been doing incredible work on our website, and we really appreciate both of those practices. I'd like to thank our board, our building and volunteer councils, our collaborators, of whom there are hundreds, and our hundreds and hundreds of volunteers who are our ambassadors on the ground over the weekend. And I have spoken to so many people this weekend in our community, and I really would like to thank you all as well, our audience, for your generosity and your warmth in sharing our love for our city. It's really incredible the way the weekend brings our community together, and I love seeing it every year. So while we wait for Open House Melbourne 2025, the July weekend, we've got regional programming coming up for you all. We've also got summer fundraising tours to keep you all occupied while you're waiting for us to come around next winter. So hop onto our website, sign up to our newsletter, and please don't be strangers. We really love to hear from you. Thank you all.